Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I am the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy. I am an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most specifically or succinctly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance that specifically use tennis to uncover what it really takes to develop a top 10 player. My work includes mitigating injuries through to pathways to develop a top 10 player, and I am that scientist or the scientist behind those landmark findings that did uncover and has uncovered how to develop a top 10 tennis player. I'm behind theories such as the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr Berge to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule and a slew of others. As has become custom in each episode, we're going to dive into one of my books and share additional insights. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. And look, today's episode it's bouncing off our previous one, though it's so integral, having the discussion around it as a whole and on its own as well. So buckle in, enjoy the ride, and I can guarantee you there are going to be some key takeaways today to implement into your own training practices and loads, specifically if we're looking at developing that pathway that progresses towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Today's episode is on functional movement, range of movement. Now, if you'd like to follow along, we are on page 107 of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success. Now, before we dig, a bit deeper and I delve into this section, it's really important to have the discussion around functional movement, but specifically range of movement. There is such a huge misconception when we're looking at how the human body moves, and especially in the sporting domain. And a lot of coaches, parents and players often make the mistake of wanting to replicate another athlete's or player's behaviors or their techniques. And the challenge there is when we're looking specifically at range of movement, everyone is different. Everyone is a different size, has different ranges of movements to flexibility, different when we look at flexion, extension, different builds up and contributing factors to their level of torque, how their kinetic chain interworks, and really how we can get the most out of the human body as a whole, specifically on that performance spectrum. Now, it's so fundamental when we're looking at range of movement, specifically in developmental players, to be incredibly mindful of this. Obviously, it's just as applicable with elite players, even more so. But when we're looking at mitigating injuries and building the foundations of a player's absolute range whilst adhering to functional movement patterns. Now, we want to adhere to those functional movement patterns because that is how we fundamentally mitigate injuries, by aligning our technical parameters with what works with the human body without compromising its current state. There is, many interpretations to different analogies around this with, I guess, a very broad language base. Though what we're talking about is really simplifying how the body moves and asking yourself if you are twisting the body in a certain way that is not supported or endorsed by the kinetic chain, then we really need to ask ourselves if it is contributing to an injury now or 3, 4, 5 years down the track. So range of movement is incredibly fundamental, and obviously it's applicable for all sports, irrespective what sport you're playing. But obviously beyond top 10 tennis, I'm going to narrow in on tennis and really have that discussion around what that range means, say for that forehand, for the serve, the backhand, the follow through the volley, irrespective of what your movement is or your stroke of choice that you're performing. We really need to interwork the technique of an athlete's performance whilst also considering their range, which goes as far as their backswing, irrespective their forehand and backhand. How far are they rotating? What is their natural range? What is their natural range for their momentum to release into the shot? What is their forward transitions like? What is that natural range, and how can we work on improving that and progressing that over a period of time? Not 1-2 days, not 1-2 weeks. It's a progression, because if we do too much and we stress our range too soon, too far, obviously again that is where injuries occur. And too often we're looking at younger athletes, whether you are 12, 13, 14, 15, are looking to behave the same way as that 24, 25 year old on the ATP or WTA tour. And when it comes down to range, potentially you are extending yourself too far and your body has not had the adequate time to adapt to that transition. So range of movement and functional movement together, obviously they're interworked, interconnected, but it's so fundamental to be mindful of this when we are developing an athlete. Because at the end of the day, if you are 12, 13, irrespective, and you want to be in it for the long game, so that's that 10 years plus of play, which we know is when that peak performance phase of growth within that next 10 year cycle begins to develop. So it is a 20-year cycle. And it's not to mean that's at the highest level of play. I mean, look, there are some very elite players, and look, we know of them who have been around the game for that long, but that's not specifically what we're talking about. We're talking about having that longevity on your side 10 years prior and 10 years at that level. And the only way that is able to be sustained is, one, if functional movement patterns and parameters are implemented, but two, you have a chance. And when I mean you have a chance, it's saying or sharing that at this stage, if you are in that developmental, niche, it's giving yourself the chance to progress without succumbing to a debilitating injury, without having, that shoulder issue that puts you out for that 2-3 years, or ends your career, which unfortunately is something that happened to me. Or you have something, as such as a foot niggle, and you develop something like plantar fasciitis to heel spurs that sidelines you again for 1 to 2 years. Again, something that happened to me. So I'm sharing this with you and speaking with you from not only that scientific standpoint and that coaching standpoint, but also that playing standpoint. And unfortunately, what happened to myself as that player athlete and the hard lessons I had to learn, and obviously went on to uncover the why. And that is a huge pretense of beyond top 10 tennis, is trying my best here, playing my part and safeguarding as many athletes as possible, irrespective if you're 12, 22, 32, and just broadening that education spectrum about how we can not only minimize our risk of injury, but also optimize our levels of play that most excitingly deliver that top 10 tennis ranking And I don't know about you, but if I was given that blueprint when I was like 12, 13, or that 17, 18, or even 22, 23 on how to develop that top 10 ranking, I'm going to grab it and latch onto it. And of course, I'm going to implement it. So it's a staggered approach so we can get there. All right, if you're obviously still with me and listening, it's about time that we dive into the chapter again on page 107. The human body is designed to move with ease, functionally. In order to produce a functional movement, a player must be aware of their range and thus their body's limits. This is very critical when we're looking at the developmental athlete, because when you are in that age bracket, you're still learning how to move your body and not necessarily mindful of that range. And that's where the parents and coaches play a critical role, is being mindful of, how that child, athlete, player is moving and if they are overextending themselves. It could be as simple as arching their back without bending the knees. And if they're doing that in a repetitive motion over and over and over again, obviously by the time they hit adolescence, that it's a window for a stress fracture in the spine. So if we can set up the foundations earlier and we can protect them in a way earlier by building not only good techniques but exceptional and functional technical parameters that we're implementing into their patterns of play, we are safeguarding them, but also it's building that framework, that baseline that is attributed to that top 10 ranking. So it's pertinent to begin with to have that discussion continuously with that child player athlete. And obviously if you are that player listening, please have this conversation with your parents and or guardian and your coach about how your body feels when you're doing a certain movement. If it feels a bit weird, have that discussion. If it's hurting, have that discussion. Now, it's so important for, again, everyone who's involved in, that triangular relationship to be a part of, what does an ouch mean? What does pain mean? What does too far mean? What does overextending mean? What does, the pain mean in this respect and or in this environment? And to really have, a really healthy understanding between, the parent and the child to the coach and the player or athlete. Because often it is overlooked that there's a language barrier there, not in, the simple context, but there's a block there within that dialogue of one person's going to interpret it this way and the other another way, because a child's athlete's definition of pain and or their threshold is going to be very different to that parents and coaches. It doesn't mean that it's not painful, but it needs to be conditioned in a way and a context that they're able to communicate, all right, and identify, this is pain, we need to rein it in, or this is pain, so I need to rest. And that is very huge, and it's so important and critical, especially, and it's also a red flag, especially when we need to implement functional movement patterns. And it's also a red flag to say there's a very high likelihood that functional movement parameters are not being implemented. Likewise, that player athlete's child range of movement is not being adhered to. It is obviously going too far or compromising their natural movement. So it sounds like a lot, but we can really rein it in, and it's so simple to being able to have that conversation and sharing with that player, athlete, child about how that feels, and then we get to work in those key technical parameters when we're looking at progressing. Okay. All players are different and can move to varied extents. However, in order to increase a player's range of movement, this is done through conditioning until the maximum range or necessary performance-reliant range is produced, whilst considering functional applications. Now, this goes back to what I was sharing earlier, that every child, athlete, player is different. And it is a progression. It's not something that happens overnight, but it is something a coach should be incorporating into their lessons and their progressions within a certain skill or set skill to further develop that child's technique. Now, if you're developing a technique, again, that's not adhering to functional movement patterns, then we really need to scrap that. And we need to begin and adapt to those functional parameters if we're looking at that longevity. If you want to develop, for the coaches out there, a player who has that 10 years at least on their side and they have longevity for the next 10, let's safeguard them to begin with. I can't tell you how many athletes I come across, specifically in Australia, who are looking to reach that level of peak play, and they are there, but they keep getting knocked back from injury. Same goes in the States. How many players are in that top echelon of play, and then injuries? And it's the same across the board there. So it's being so mindful that, unfortunately, for the parents out there, not all coaches are actually in the minority that have this awareness of functional movement patterns and the progression of that range of movement. And if you are a coach listening out there, please, please, please upskill and be mindful of this, because it plays such a huge part in mitigating those injuries that are going to happen in that 5 to 10 years. So if we can build the foundations in a healthy way now, that sets them up for success later. There is many clubs and academies, and I was at one again a couple of months ago, and we have these juniors, and we're looking between that 8 years to that 12-13 year range, and they're playing exceptional. However, they are not adhering to functional movement patterns, nor is their range of movement being mindful of. Now, this coach was very adamant in what they were doing and their work. And the sad part is that I was standing there going, each one of these children, they're not going to be playing in 10 years' time because an injury is going to happen. So for the parents out there, alarm bells should be ringing. For the players and athletes out there, you could be performing exceptional, but we're having a conversation here about, do you want to be around in 10 years' time playing the sport you love? It is not about succeeding and getting all those ranking points when you're 8, 9, 10 years of age. That is not the point. If that does happen, it is a bonus if you are adhering to those functional movement patterns and the progressions involved, and looking after and respecting that range of movement and being incredibly mindful of that, and that open dialogue is there between what that ouch means and what pain means, etc., and that mutual understanding is there within that triangular approach. There are so many children out there, irrespective of what centre you're at, it's happening and irrespective of what country, it's happening. So it's so important, integral, fundamental, critical, pivotal to have that conversation and that level of awareness for the parents, for the coaches, and for the players. Because at the end of the day, if you are 10, you've been playing for that 1-2 years. Let's look at that 10 years. So by the time you are 20, 21, we're starting to peak. We're starting to reach that elite performance spectrum on the WTA and or ATP tours. And at the end of the day, you want another 10. So you want to be playing at a high level of play until you are that 30, 31 years of age, potentially, and even longer. Now, to get there, we need to look after ourselves, safeguard ourselves, and then even more, look at that functional movement parameters at that developmental level and continue. If we are not doing that now, early on, you're putting yourself at a greater risk. And that's why we see so many athletes drop off that performance spectrum in that teenage bracket and those teenage years. Though there's so much we can do to mitigate that. Here we go. This means that a player is able to move their body in the desired way without causing their body further strain, and is something all athletes are capable of achieving with the right conditioning over time. Now, this definitely talks back to what we've gone on about, but it reiterates the time. But it's not so much as, that 10, 20 years that we're talking about, which is, look, the pathway's there in one of my books, which is I Am Your Tennis Coaching Guru, which is filled with the pathways to planners. Though what we're talking about here is that your range of movement develops in progression. So when we look at that, it's let's go, if you want to try and touch your toes, and this is specifically, I'll say, for the parents and the coaches out there, it does not happen for most of us on the first go. Some are lucky enough, and it does for the very nimble and flexible. Though we can all do it if we go, all right, so you're with me? So it's a stagnated approach where you'll go down once and you'll get maybe halfway. A second time, you'll go down. Now, this happens obviously in a very short time frame. We can all do this within, that 20 to 30 second time frame. And we get closer and closer and closer. Some of us will be lucky and we'll be able to put our hands on the ground. Others, we will notice our range with each try gets a little better, a little better, a little better. But that is a very, simplified example of a progression. For the player athlete, however, this is something that takes weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. It's not something that happens overnight because we are developing the human body. We are developing our range of motion. We are looking at our technique as a whole and then focusing on the discrete skill that we're working on and then interworking that with the serial skill. So if we're looking at the discrete skill, it could be what our wrist is doing specifically at contact. So it's a very specific discrete movement. But in the serial skill, then we're looking at the actual forehand and how it all interworks. So the discrete movements of a skill is what we're doing to build up the skill as a whole, so the serial skill. And without getting too complex, I'll rein that back in. It's really about simplifying it, going, okay, I'm happy with each integral step within this movement, within this technique, and now let's look at the range. So there's so many interworking pieces responsible for that technique and developing that technique. And then when we're looking at range of movement and implementing range of movement and progressing our range, you can see why this does not happen overnight. It's a progression, and it's something that it's critical to be mindful of within that progression. So it could be just very subtle in week 1, and all it is very subtle. And then when we start and begin to fine tune each specific and succinct discrete skill, and then when we are happy with the whole skill, so that serial skill, and we go, okay, now let's look at the range. Because if we start looking at the range without developing the correct technique, so that those correct discrete skills to begin with, then we may not be adhering to functional movement patterns and be putting ourselves at a risk of injury. So it can get very complex, though at the end of the day, it's actually relatively quite simple when we're merely, or most specifically, adhering to the natural movements of the body. The warning signs are, and the huge red flags are, when coaches out there begin to compromise the human body. And a very simple and saturated example of this is, again, I will use the forehand. is that you have so many coaches teaching a child topspin with heavy balls, so we can even say the yellow tennis balls, which, I mean, if you are familiar, obviously at the developmental levels, it's stagnated, whether it's, red, orange, green, then yellow. And I think everyone could have a different interpretation, slightly different. But yellow, let's say we're looking at 100% pressure. And when you're teaching a skill at 100% pressure, that ball goes higher. The child then, player, athlete, begins to hit that ball higher, and that is their typical pattern, and that's what feels good to them, because that's what they're taught, to make sure it feels good. But at the end of the day, they're compromising because the ball essentially is bouncing higher than them. So as an adult or a coach, well, the whole parent, imagine hitting something above your shoulder consistently over and over and over and over again. You're going to injure your shoulder. Like, we know that from a scientific perspective, from a functional movement perspective. When we look at the technical parameters to the discrete skills, we know that's an injury. Unfortunately, not many coaches do, or they negate to share that, or they're naive about that. Irrespective, though, that is why it's so critical and fundamental to capture it early on. Now, these movements, obviously that ball should be dropping a lot lower, and that child, athlete, player should be taught to contact that ball where it's natural. And here's a huge secret, and it's one of the 7 keys, is that if they're contacting it obviously around or below their hip height, that is where it should be. If they're not, that's okay. It just means, no, they're not going to develop a top 10 ranking. It's that simple. And that's how critical and exciting and phenomenal technical patterns are, because we know what that correlates with, which is incredibly exciting, again, from a playing, coaching, scientific standpoint, is that when we're able to adapt our movements to correspond with the human body and our natural movements, our natural patterns of play, and we're able to nurture that and implement that, then we're setting ourselves up for success. And we're not only looking after our body, we're safeguarding our body, looking at preventing, I guess, those injuries long term, but also we're building the framework that also corresponds with becoming one of the best players in the world. So if you are that 21, 22-year-old listening, that 25-year-old listening, you are on the ATP and or WTA tour, and you want to get to the top 10, this is just as applicable. It means there's a very good reason, if you're ranked top 50 in the world, top 20 in the world, the reason why you are not progressing to a top 10 ranking, look at your ball height, look where you're contacting the ball. And that's what I said, is that science can get very complicated, but also very simple. And this is one of the most simple pieces of the puzzle. So if you are able to drop that ball height consistently and more consistently, it happens over time. It's not going to happen overnight, because when we're used to performing a certain skill, and this goes back to those discrete skills, to the serial skill and how it's developed. So when you're, that fundamental baseline is developed, when you are that 13, 14-year-old, it's still with you. So when you are in your 20s, so we need to scrap that back. So we need a regression in a way. So when we pull that back, then we're allowed to progress. But unfortunately, we do need to regress slightly, and then we need to recondition ourselves to be able to progress with that height. And really what we're doing is that we are listening to our body. We're integrating those natural patterns back in, because we've been conditioned to remove that. So at the end of that cycle, it is easier, but it is cyclical in that way, that you regress and progress and regress and progress. Unfortunately, when the initial baseline is not set up and does not, cooperate with those functional movement parameters, that is respecting the body as a whole, which is so fundamental. And often one of the biggest mistakes for junior players, developmental players, and or high performance players, it's both the same in respect to the mistake is made for the players, coaches, parents, and all involved, is looking at the current elite. because the current elite, they're at different heights, different patterns work for them, different ranges work for them, and it's what your body corresponds with. Everyone in some way, shape or form is the same. And again, in some way, shape or form, but not identical. Everyone identifies in a different way with different patterns of play that feel more natural to them. But irrespective of what feels natural, we still need to be mindful of that kinetic chain. So we still need to be mindful of how the body moves, naturally those functional movement patterns and that range. And I think we're going to finish on that because, look, it's a very, it's really a simple topic, but it can get quite, complicated because it is very detailed when we really want to break it down. Now, I hope, you can see why we broke it down is to see how, complicated it is, all the moving pieces involved in a skill to begin with. And we need to be so mindful of each one of those, those bolts, if you want. If we're looking at, that wheel that's going over and round, around and around, the only reason it does that because there are interworking pieces that allow that to happen. So the same is applicable for that player or athlete, and even more so if they're 8, 9, 10 years old, and again even more so when they're 16, 17, and those modifications need to be made because of their growing phases. And then the same is applicable for that 20, 21-year-old when they're ready to progress to the next stage because they're capable of building more muscle mass, and so their ranges and what they're capable of and their levels of power continue to progress and grow. So it's incredibly exciting and rewarding, and it is a progression that happens over time. Though it's being mindful of it is over time. It's not something that necessarily happens overnight. It's about putting the work in long term and having that plan and being mindful of what that looks like. And look, at the end of the day, we started talking about range of movement, and it's so important, and I'm sure you can hear how passionate I am about it because I know what it's like from that player's standpoint to not be able to play, to have to hang up the boots, so to speak, and all rackets in that case. But I also know, from that elite coaching standpoint with all the athletes I've worked with over the years, and I've been so lucky to have such phenomenal results with working with players for such short periods of time and implementing those functional patterns into the game. And, the next thing you know that they're winning tournaments. It's so rewarding and exciting when you're able to make just those subtle changes and the player, athlete, or parent is receptive to be able to do that. And for the coaches out there, we work in tandem, and that's what this is all about. It's that you're working with your athlete, with that player, and Beyond Top 10 Tennis is here to help nudge you closer by being more mindful of those progressions. All right, we're going to wrap today up on that because progressions, range of movement, functional movement, it's so important. So if there's anything you can take away from today's episode, I hope it is being more mindful of progressions and the role of your range of movement, specifically if you're really serious about and looking towards heading towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. To grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, please head on over to AM8 International. That's am8international.com. For any comments or questions, please head on over to AM8 as well, or to Topic Thread. That's topicthread.com. It's the only social network that I'm on. However, we do have new social networks or social handles now available, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok to LinkedIn. You're most welcome to jump on them and leave your comments. and I will personally see, I'll say most of them. I will do my best to see all of them, but remember to tag Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and also I get even more so to share, I think, if you've learned or you've got some incredible or important insights, that would be absolutely wonderful. If you'd like something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's pinkoctopusbooks.com, and that's where my fictional release is. So that's more so for, the coaches and parents out there, for something different. I will leave all the links in the bio, and remember to have a peek at those show notes, because I always like leaving something in there, and that's from me to you. And same goes with episode questions. They're specifically on Spotify. So if you're listening on Apple, Google, Amazon, or iHeartRadio, irrespective where you're listening, those questions are available if you head on over to Spotify. So that's just something a little bit different, but kind of cool. And I do read all of those replies. So thank you so much. On that note, I am so grateful. We're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. And you know what? If you have been with us from the very beginning, thank you so much for your patience. If you have just tuned in, thank you also, because we have been finding the ropes, and as promised, slowly and steadily, but I think we're getting there. And your feedback for all of you out there has been so incredibly appreciated, and please keep it coming. On that note, I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.